The Café Bright Ray stood at the corner of a quiet street in the historic center of New Orleans, like a small pearl among old buildings with peeling paint. This place was known not only for its signature hot chocolate and fresh croissants, but also for its unparalleled cozy atmosphere. Stained glass windows let in soft light, painting colorful patterns on wooden tables. The walls were adorned with old black and white photographs capturing the golden era of jazz, when the city was alive with the sounds of trumpets and saxophones. In the center of the room stood a piano, covered with a layer of dust. It hadn't been played in years, but its presence added a special touch of charm. In the evenings, the cafe filled with the aromas of fresh pastries and the muted laughter of regular patrons. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, leaving behind the noise and bustle of the modern world. Jamie, a 12-year-old boy, barely reached the high tables as he wiped them with a cloth. He wore an old apron that was far too big for his thin frame. His hair, overgrown and messy, stuck out from under a faded baseball cap. Jamie lived nearby with his mother and came here every evening after school to help her. His work was unnoticeable but essential. Cleaning tables, carrying heavy buckets of dishes to the kitchen, straightening chairs. He didn't complain even though other kids his age spent this time playing baseball or watching TV. During breaks, Jamie would steal glances at the piano. He loved music, especially jazz, which played from the old radio in the kitchen every evening. His grandmother, who had once worked as a pianist in a bar in the French Quarter, had taught Jamie a few melodies. He often remembered how her fingers danced across the keys. Jamie dreamed of hearing that sound again, but the cafe's piano had long been considered just a piece of decor. The door burst open with a bang, and Henry Broxton walked in. His footsteps echoed against the walls. Everyone in the cafe turned their heads. Henry was tall, lean, with piercing gray eyes. His perfectly tailored suit and expensive watch screamed money and status. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a man accustomed to asserting his superiority. For Henry, obstacles didn't exist. People were merely pawns to serve his goals. He removed his expensive sunglasses, quickly scanning the room. His gaze stopped on Jamie, who was diligently wiping a table, holding the cloth with both hands. Henry smirked, and it wasn't a kind smile but rather a mocking one. "Hey, boy!" he called out loudly, drawing everyone's attention. Jamie froze, the cloth slipping from his hands. He looked up, glancing around uncertainly as if checking whether the call was truly meant for him. "Yes, you," Henry confirmed, stepping closer. "Can you do anything in life besides wiping tables? Judging by the look of you, that's probably your ceiling, isn't it?" Henry's voice was deliberately loud, and his words stung like thorns. A few patrons turned their heads. Jamie felt his face burning. It seemed like the entire room was watching him. "How did they even hire you here?" Henry continued, shaking his head. "Is this cafe so desperate that they'd take someone like you?" "Ha! I didn't think I'd see someone treating a table with a rag as if it were their greatest achievement in life." Jamie lowered his gaze but couldn't resist a brief glance at Henry. The man's gray eyes radiated absolute confidence in his impunity. "What? No words?" Henry pressed on, squinting. "I suppose you've been told since childhood that your place is in the corner, picking up crumbs after others. Or do you think you're capable of something more? I bet you're not a star at school, are you? Or maybe you want to prove me wrong." His words left no doubt. This wasn't just a challenge but an attempt to put Jamie in his place. A few patrons exchanged glances. Some tried to return to their meals but clearly couldn't concentrate. Tension hung in the air. Jamie stayed silent. His hands trembled, but he clenched his fists, trying to maintain control. He remembered his grandmother's words. "Don't let anyone make you feel smaller than you are." Jamie took a deep breath, trying to suppress the waves of anxiety washing over him. Henry, waiting for a response, crossed his arms over his chest and leaned slightly forward, as if savoring every second of his game. It seemed like he was trying to crush the boy with a single look. "Well, kid," the businessman drawled, his tone dripping with even more mockery, "do you know how to do anything? Or is your only talent pretending to be invisible?" Jamie remembered how his grandmother had proudly said that even in the toughest moments, It was essential to maintain dignity. Her words suddenly echoed in his mind. Don't let anyone make you feel smaller than you are. He lifted his gaze to Henry. His eyes, bright with a mix of nerves and barely restrained anger, met the businessman's cold, self-satisfied stare. Jamie swallowed hard, feeling a lump rise in his throat. But he wasn't about to back down. I can play the piano. For a moment, the cafe fell silent, broken only by the faint clinking of dishes. Henry raised an eyebrow, his smirk turning into outright laughter. Play the piano? You? He laughed so loudly that a few patrons flinched. Seriously? A boy who wipes tables thinks he can be a musician. Are you sure you even know which way to sit at the piano? Jamie felt Henry's laughter pierce through him like needles. His cheeks burned, but he took a step forward, gripping the cloth in his hand more tightly. I know, he said firmly. His voice was louder than he had expected. And if you don't believe me, I can prove it. Henry stopped, clearly taken aback by the reply. He squinted, then slowly walked toward the piano in the corner of the cafe. His long fingers brushed over the instrument's lid, leaving a trail on the dusty surface. Prove it, he said, not taking his eyes off Jamie. All right, go ahead. Show us all that you're more than just a kid with a rag. Or, Henry paused, turning to the other patrons. Or are you afraid that your talent is as dusty as this old piano? A murmur spread through the room. Some faces showed curiosity, while others clearly disapproved of Henry's actions. But Jamie heard only the pounding of his heart. He felt his feet moving toward the piano on their own. As he approached the instrument, he stopped. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the keyboard cover. The piano looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The keys were dusty but still sturdy. Jamie ran his finger across one of them, wiping away the grime. Well, what are you waiting for? Henry prodded, settling into a chair opposite. I'm not going to sit here all day for you. Jamie glanced toward his mother, who had peeked out from the kitchen, drawn by the commotion. Her face was a mix of worry and encouragement. He inhaled deeply, recalling how his grandmother used to play Swing by the River for him, her fingers dancing effortlessly over the keys. It had been their special song. He sat down on the hard bench, straightened his back, placed his hands on the keys and closed his eyes. He needed to forget about Henry, about the watching patrons, and about his fear. It was just him and the music. Jamie took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes were hesitant, but with each chord, his hands gained confidence and precision. Remembering the melody, he fully immersed himself in the rhythm. His fingers moved across the keys with a grace that surprised even him. The music came to life, filling the room with sounds of freedom, energy, and something profoundly powerful. Gradually, the cafe, once filled with quiet murmurs and the clinking of utensils, fell silent. All eyes were on Jamie, this small boy who seemed to merge with the music in perfect harmony. Even Henry was silent, sitting in his chair with a look of astonishment on his face. The sound of the piano washed over the walls of Bright Ray Cafe like a flowing river. Jamie played with his eyes closed, fully immersed in the music. Each note resonated in his soul, as if he were living his life through the melody. The pain of daily struggles, the joy of fleeting moments of happiness, and the hope for something greater. The keys, dusty and old, produced an unexpectedly pure sound. Swing by the River filled the room with an energy that was impossible to ignore. The melody rose and slowed, holding the audience captive, their breaths caught in suspense. People who had been chatting animatedly at their tables moments ago froze, not daring to move for fear of breaking the magic. Jamie, his hands unwavering on the keys, felt his confidence grow with every chord. He knew this was his chance to show that he was more than just a boy with a rag. This was his voice, his story. When the final note dissolved into the air, a profound silence enveloped the cafe. No one moved. No one whispered. It was a silence filled with awe and wonder. Then, applause broke out. At first, it was tentative, but soon it swelled, filling the entire space. People rose from their seats, clapping as loudly as they could. Some shouted, "Bravo," while others simply smiled, shaking their heads in disbelief. Jamie, trembling, slowly stood up from the bench. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. He looked toward his mother, who stood by the kitchen door, wiping tears with her apron. Her face radiated pride, mingled with a touch of astonishment. But Jamie's gaze eventually landed on Henry Broxton. The businessman sat in his chair, motionless, as though he had been struck dumb. His face, always so smug and self-assured, now bore a different expression. It was a mixture of surprise and bewilderment, as if he couldn't believe that the boy he had just belittled was capable of such brilliance. Henry rose to his feet, attempting to maintain his composure. He walked slowly toward Jamie, the arrogance in his stride noticeably diminished. For a few seconds, they stared at each other in silence. Jamie's gaze was steady, free of malice, but filled with pride and confidence. "Well," Henry finally said, his voice quieter than before, "you play well. I guess I underestimated you." The words sounded like an admission, though they seemed to come with great difficulty. But before Jamie could respond, someone from the room shouted, "You were amazing, kid." Another voice joined in, "Play something else." Jamie felt his face flush again, but this time it was from excitement, not shame. He wasn't sure he could play another piece, but the applause and smiles of the crowd filled him with a newfound strength. "Thank you," he said at last, addressing everyone. His voice trembled, but it was sincere. "Thank you so much." Henry, realizing the spotlight had shifted away from him, retreated to his table. Any attempt he made to offer a snide remark sounded weak and unconvincing, and no one paid him any attention. Jamie's mother came closer and embraced him, whispering, "I'm so proud of you, my boy." Jamie turned back to the piano, his fingers brushing over the keys, and he felt something change deep within him. Today, he had proven to himself and everyone else that his dreams were valid and worth pursuing. The following evening at Bright Ray Cafe felt like any other. Jamie was back to his usual tasks, wiping tables and clearing dishes as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet, the looks from the patrons betrayed that his performance had left its mark. Some nodded approvingly as he passed, others smiled warmly, and a couple of regulars even patted him on the shoulder. "Hey, kid," called out a man sitting at the counter. "I was here last night. You were really something. Mark my words, you're going to be famous one day." Jamie smiled but didn't get a chance to reply before the cafe door swung open, revealing a stranger. The man was tall, sporting light stubble and a fashionable jacket. Confidence radiated from his posture, but his eyes held a friendly warmth. He scanned the room quickly before his gaze settled on Jamie. "You're the boy who played the piano last night, right?" the man asked. Jamie hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, that was me," he said, setting his cleaning cloth aside. "Fantastic." The stranger grinned and extended a hand. "I'm Tom Whitaker, a music producer. You've got real talent." Jamie's mother, overhearing the conversation, stepped out of the kitchen to stand beside her son, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Excuse me, but what brings you here?" she asked politely. Tom turned to her, then back to Jamie. "I happened to be here last night and caught your son's performance. Do you realize how gifted he is? With his talent, he could go far. I'd like to help him record a demo. It's a chance to show his abilities to people who can help him build a career." The offer was so unexpected that Jamie was momentarily speechless. His mother furrowed her brow, clearly processing what she'd just heard. "A demo? A career?" she repeated, tilting her head. "That sounds wonderful. But we can't afford anything like that." "You don't have to worry about a thing," Tom said quickly. "I'll cover all the costs. All I need is your permission." This could be the first step toward something incredible for Jamie. Jamie looked up at his mother, his eyes shining with hope. He wanted to say something, but he was afraid his request might seem selfish. "Mama," he finally whispered, "this is a chance." She looked at her son, then at Tom again. Her expression softened as she exhaled. "All right," she said at last. If it's really free and if it can help Jamie, I'll agree. Tom's smile widened. Perfect. I'll arrange everything and be in touch. Trust me. This is just the beginning. After Tom left, Jamie and his mother stood in silence, still absorbing what had just happened. Jamie couldn't suppress a grin, and her eyes shone with pride, tinged with a mother's natural concern for the unknown future. A week later, Jamie found himself in a real recording studio. The room was illuminated by glowing equipment, its walls lined with soundproof panels. The microphones and piano were so sleek and modern that he felt out of place. But as he sat at the instrument, he felt that familiar warmth return. Music had always been his home. Tom watched him from behind the glass partition. "You ready, Jamie?" he asked calmly. Jamie nodded, placing his hands on the keys. He closed his eyes, imagining he was back at the cafe, and began to play the same melody that had touched so many hearts a week before. The sound was rich and resonant, every note filling the room with emotion. When he finished, Tom entered the studio, clapping. "Amazing, kid. This demo is going to win people over. I'm sure of it." The recording quickly made its way through the city's music circles. Within days, Bright Ray Cafe became a local hotspot. People flocked there not just for coffee and croissants, but to see the boy whose music had captured the city's heart. A journalist from a local newspaper published an article titled, "A Musical Talent from the Shadows." How a boy from a poor family inspired New Orleans. Jamie watched as life began to shift for him and his mother. Though the road ahead was full of uncertainties, he had learned one thing for sure. His dream was no longer out of reach. Weeks had passed since Jamie first set foot in the recording studio. His demo, crafted under Tom Whitaker's guidance, spread rapidly through musical circles. Jazz clubs began showing interest in the young pianist, and journalists scrambled to interview him. For Jamie, who had been clearing tables not long ago, it all felt like a dream. At Bright Ray Cafe, the atmosphere was livelier than ever. Customers flocked not only for the cozy ambience but also to catch a glimpse of Jamie. Some asked him to play, others inquired about his aspirations. His mother, always reserved and modest, watched with quiet pride as her son became a local sensation. Not everyone, however, was thrilled. Henry Broxton, who once used the cafe as a backdrop for his business meetings, now visited far less often. When he did show up, he tried to stay out of the spotlight, avoiding Jamie altogether. But one evening, unable to bear the attention surrounding the boy, he finally snapped. "Ridiculous," he said loudly, addressing his companions at the table. "Everyone's acting like this kid's the next Ellington. But who is he really? Just a cleaner who got lucky." Although his words were directed at his companions, many overheard, including Jamie, who stood behind the counter. The remark cut deep, but recalling his newfound confidence, Jamie turned to face the businessman. "Maybe I am just a cleaner," Jamie said firmly, locking eyes with Henry. "But that doesn't make me any less worthy. I'm simply doing what I love. And if you think that's just luck, maybe you should try loving something just as much." A hush fell over the room. For a moment, Henry was visibly taken aback, unprepared for such a response. Before he could retort, a patron broke the silence. "Well said, kid," he called out. The room erupted in applause. Henry, realizing he had lost the room's favor, stood, tossed some bills on the table, and left the cafe. It was his last visit. Soon after, Jamie received an invitation to perform at one of New Orleans' renowned jazz clubs. It was a significant milestone. Playing on a stage that had once hosted the greatest jazz musicians was a dream come true. Tom took care of the arrangements, and Jamie's mother, despite their modest means, made him a new suit for the occasion. On the night of the performance, Jamie's nerves churned like a storm. His hands trembled with anticipation. But as he stepped onto the stage, he reminded himself why he was there. The spotlight illuminated the piano, and the audience quieted, waiting in anticipation. Jamie sat at the piano and closed his eyes for a moment. He pictured the cafe, the warm glow of the stained glass, and the first melody his grandmother had ever played for him. His fingers touched the keys, and the room filled with the sounds of swing on the river. The music flowed, vibrant and alive, and Jamie knew this was where he belonged, on stage, connecting with people through his music. When the final note faded, the audience erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, shouting words of encouragement. Jamie beamed, knowing this moment had changed his life forever. After the concert, an elderly man with silver hair and an elegant cane approached him. "You brought back the best years of my life, son," the man said with a warm smile. "I'm Benjamin Reeves. I used to play in this very club. You're remarkable, and I want you to know, you have something special. Don't lose it." Those words inspired Jamie even more. He realized his journey was only beginning.